Brandon will kick. Everybody's okay with being recorded? Right. And then I guess when you guys are ready, I'm going to mute, and then whoever's going to start the meeting, hopefully Brandon.
You want me to start the meeting? I didn't think I was doing that.
Oh yeah, I can do it. Like let's see, start the meeting.
Oh no, the meeting started. We already have 12 people in the audience.
Oh, excellent. That's all I meant. It's just switch us over from
yes.
mode to.
I thought you wanted to present something, and I was like, uh-oh.
I'm gonna be quiet. I'm gonna be quiet now.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for being here, and welcome and good afternoon. Happy Sustainability Week. Thank you for joining us today at this virtual roundtable on building a human scale campus and human scale streets. My name is Kinahan, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Urban and Public Affairs here at UofL, and I am delighted to be moderating this panel here today. So just to talk a little bit about our format for our program, so I'm going to give a couple of housekeeping items and some other introductory material up front, and then we'll turn the floor over to our wonderful panel. And each of them have some slides to share and sort of some expanded introductory information about some of their work. And then from there, we will open the floor up to questions. And I'll have a couple of questions for the panel, and we invite and encourage questions from the audience. So if you have questions along the way, please use the Q&A feature, which is down at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So if you sort of hover over the bottom, you should see the Q&A square or area pop up, and you can submit your questions that way. And we will do our best to get through all of those and incorporate them into today's conversation. A couple of other housekeeping items. We are recording today's session. So just that everyone is aware of that, and we'll send a link to everybody who registered for today and encourage you to share that with others that couldn't join us. Again, we welcome your questions, so please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We also welcome you to introduce yourselves to our gathered virtual audience and use the chat feature to introduce yourselves and to share any comments or feedback that you might have as we move through today's panel discussion. A couple of thank yous as well. We'd like to thank the Commonwealth Center for sponsoring today's event. And I will put a link in the chat so that everybody can learn a little bit more about the great work that the Commonwealth Center does on campus. I'd also like to thank the Sustainability Council for organizing today's event, in particular, Dr. Angela Story, who is the chair of the Sustainability Council and an assistant professor of anthropology, and Pat Smith, the assistant director of community engagement, and also an alumni of our Masters of Urban Planning program. And I will also put a link in the chat to some of the great work that the Sustainability Council does, and remind you of the events that are remaining in Sustainability Week. And I'll cover those again at the end of today's event. And then lastly, thank you to the College of Arts and Sciences for allowing us to use the Zoom webinar platform, and special thanks to Brandon Harwood, our resident tech expert and Zoom expert, and he's been patiently walking us Microsoft Teams users through the Zoom platform. So we appreciate Brandon. Okay, so before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to take a minute to sort of set the context for today's discussion. So at a very global scale, as we're thinking about and working on the changes or the many challenges related to climate change, reshaping our transportation networks and our transportation patterns is a critical element of that work, especially when we think about making our cities and neighborhoods more safe and accessible for pedestrians, cyclists, transit riders, All of that is necessary alongside other policy changes to reduce driving as a means of reducing carbon emissions. At a more localized level, developing and expanding human scale transportation networks are also a critical component of improving quality of life across Louisville's urban and suburban neighborhoods. Robust transit options are necessary for connecting workers to employment. Sidewalks and pedestrian infrastructure make it possible for kids to walk to school, and protected bike lanes can offer alternative commuting options. All of these elements of our built environment, including our transportation networks, we know are shaped by systems of inequality, and thus our solutions to these challenges have to be informed. Our policies and strategies have to be informed explicitly by through a lens of racial equity and social justice. So the panel that we have gathered here today of planners, engineers, and community advocates have vast knowledge and expertise when it comes to reshaping our transportation systems and creating human scale street patterns. I want to thank each of them for joining us today and just give them a brief introduction, and then we'll turn the floor over to each of them for expanded introductory remarks. So joining us here today, we have Mike King, who is the Director of Louisville Metro Government's Office of Advanced Planning and Sustainability. And following Mike, we'll hear from Katie Rowe, Transportation Engineer at Gresham Smith. Also joining us today is Carrie Butler, the Executive Director of TARC, the Transit Authority of River City. And lastly, Chris Glasser, the Executive Director of Bicycling for Louisville and Streets for People. So at this point, I will turn the floor over to Mike, and from there we'll proceed with opening remarks from our other panelists following the order of introductions.
Hey everybody, thanks for having me today. Really excited to talk with you all about something that we find really important in Louisville Metro government and on my team specifically within Metro government, and that's planning transportation systems around people. Obviously, Louisville's had a transportation system for some time that's pretty car-centric, and people tend to like it that way. So moving that needle is a challenge, but through our office, we do a lot of multimodal planning and efforts throughout the community that we hope starts to shift that paradigm a little bit, to show people there are better ways for people to get around. But from our perspective, the most important piece to that is sort of from the safety side of things, that if people don't feel safe, they're not going to walk, they're not going to bike, they'll probably still ride scooters because everybody loves scooters. But the safety component is really, really important for those as well. So as we start to think through our infrastructure, I'm not a traffic engineer. I work with a lot of traffic engineers. So on our team, we collaborate a lot with the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet, with our Public Works Department, with TARC, of course, with a lot of our planning efforts. So I was really, and unfortunately I can't get to my slide deck right now because our IT is giving us some issues. So I'm really just going to kind of go bullet point through a couple of the things that I was going to talk about and speak generally about them. Then we'd love if anybody has questions for a little bit more specifics about those, happy to. So the first one is one that we've been working on for some time now, and that's converting one-way streets to two-way streets. The reality when you think about a one-way street is it's built with one intent, and the intent is to get cars through there as quickly as possible. The two big ones that come to mind in relation to the University of Louisville campus are 2nd and 3rd Street. And not only are they two one-way streets that come right to the campus, they also converge right there, which creates a really kind of tricky point for a lot of people in a highly pedestrianized area with really good TARC service that comes through there and a lot of TARC ridership as well. So that is something we as Metro are looking system-wide at all the one-way streets throughout the community, but that's one that's really high on our list of looking at an opportunity to switch those over. It's not as easy as just changing some stripes on the line and letting people get through there. We wish it was, but there's a lot of nuances to think through. Namely with that one, if we convert both to two-way, they're both state roads, and the state doesn't need two of the same route going through there. So Metro then takes on control and cost of maintenance of one of those roads. So those are the things that we have to think through from a long-term operational standpoint of which road makes the most sense for us to control, and how do we financially provide the services that are needed for that. The other one I was going to talk kind of briefly about is scooters and bikes and those sort of things. Our office heads up a lot of the policies around those. We just recently updated on what we call sort of micro mobility vehicles. And that's because when we plan for bikes, inevitably we have to plan for scooters now. And inevitably, again, something else is coming that nobody knows anything about. So we've got to be ready for those too. So we recently updated our ordinance, strangely, based on state and local statutes and ordinances. Scooters weren't allowed to be on the sidewalk or the street or in a bike lane. So they're kind of illegal everywhere, the way it was set up. So from this new ordinance, basically what we've done is dictated that scooters should be using the bike facilities. They shouldn't be on the sidewalks. They go too fast to be interacting with people, but they shouldn't be on a roadway either, because you're a very vulnerable user on those. So on top of that, the thing that seems to drive people the most crazy about scooters is they just get left everywhere. So some other efforts that we're trying to do right now is we are working to establish basically parking corrals for the scooters. It's really hard to regulate that and to mandate that people use those. So instead, the strategy we're going to use is to incentivize people. So if you park your scooter after you're finished using it in one of these dedicated areas, maybe you get $1 off on your next ride or something along those lines. The challenge with a scooter and the joy, and I think one of the reasons it's so beloved by so many people, is it does get you exactly where you want to go, and you hop off and you're done. You don't have to worry about locking it up or anything like that. So we do have to provide some pretty good incentives to improve upon that. On the bike side, our office works with Public Works to oversee the Louisville, which is the city's bike share program. We just recently re-upped with our operator for that system. And we were looking to make some what we hope will be some positive, impactful, but also some substantial changes to the system, namely with the location of stations. Right now, we've got the stations are a little bit too densely put together. So what we're finding is we're not getting that ride kind of sharing between places. So as we start to spread those out, including at the University of Louisville campus, those will be opportunities for us to do a little bit better there. The other ones are kind of a little bit more project specific, but just to let everybody know, it's not right on UofL, but we're doing a study of the entire Preston Street / highway corridor and looking at that as an opportunity for a complete street retrofit, which basically means it's not functioning for everybody. It's only functioning for a few modes of travel right now. So to make it more opportunistic for everybody to be able to use that corridor to get around, but also with a strong emphasis on the transit component of that, because there's high ridership along that Preston corridor. And although it's not right next to UofL, there's probably a lot of people that use that Preston route or routes to access close to UofL to be able to get to there. So those connections kind of on the periphery on campus, especially on our major arterials, are really, really important. The only other one that I'll talk about is a project that was recently completed, again, not right on university campus, but it's pretty close, and that's a road diet we did over on Taylor Boulevard and Winkler Avenue. For those of you that aren't familiar with road diets, it's basically where you take a road that has excess capacity for cars to go. You reduce the number of lanes, you can add bike facilities, you can add on-street parking, a lot of other things. So that was a project that helps slow traffic and calm it as it comes into campus, so people aren't used to flying in going 60 miles an hour down Winkler. But the other thing that was really good about this, and everybody that's ever been to UofL is familiar with, it's also integrating some new system to hopefully get trucks to stop going underneath 3rd Street at the underpass there at the railroad and stop getting tomahawked. So that was a fun sort of component for it that we were able to add to the project, and hopefully that will cover that. So that was a lot real quick. I apologize. Again, I was just trying to touch on some of the topics of what we do that were pertinent here. So I'll pass it on to the next person, but if anyone has questions later, I'd be happy to answer.
Thanks, Mike. I believe I am the next presenter. So let me get myself queued up here real quick. Get my slideshow going. I do have a few slideshows or a few slides here to share. My name is Katie Rowe. I'm a transportation engineer and planner with Gresham Smith. I do have my email up here, but I'll drop it in the chat after this because this is going to go pretty quickly. But if anybody wanted to follow up with me after our discussion today, I'd be more than happy to do so. I'll keep this very, very brief. The elevator pitch for Gresham Smith, we have 23 office locations. We provide a wide range of engineering and architecture services built around the built environment. And our tagline is genuine ingenuity. And really what that is all about is building partnerships like this one to better serve our communities that we live, work, and play in. And also, you know, providing an innovative and forward-thinking approach to all of our services. So what I do is I specialize in active transportation planning and design. And it looks a little bit different than your traditional roadway planning. So I've got up here kind of some of our traditional roadway data sets. You know, you've got speed, you have turning movement counts. And this tells us a lot about cars, but this doesn't tell us a lot about people who are utilizing the corridor. And so really, we kind of have to get into some additional considerations when we're looking to develop human scale streets or even retrofit streets to become more human scale and less car centric. Basically, in each of these categories, we're evaluating the comfort, the safety, and the connectivity of our networks, particularly those that serve our more vulnerable roadway users, making sure that we're developing, again, those human scale effects so that people will choose active transportation rather than driving. If we don't make it really desirable, a lot of people won't intuitively make that choice. And I also wanted to touch on Eastern Parkway just really briefly while I have you guys. You know, all of these considerations about comfort and safety and connectivity and more were inherent in the Eastern Parkway Transportation Plan, which we completed earlier this year. And, you know, within that plan, obviously, I don't have enough time to go through the entirety of the plan. We could talk for days about Eastern Parkway, but there were a wide range of recommended improvements, both for transportation, traffic calming, safety, active transportation, access management, but also looking at our green spaces, you know, relocating overhead electric, our tree infrastructure, making sure that we're preserving the historic nature of the Parkway corridor and really bringing that character back into the areas that are missing some of that tree canopy and character itself. If you guys are interested, I will also drop this link in the chat. Please, after today or after this presentation, go to louisvilleparkways.org and you'll be able to open and review the entire Eastern Parkway Transportation Plan. It is not a light read, it is quite substantial. But I wanted to go ahead and pull out just a couple highlights real quick. We did holistically recommend a roadway reconfiguration. So taking from that more dangerous high-speed 4-lane configuration to a 3-lane configuration, which slows traffic and improves safety for everyone, but it also allows us to bring in those light vehicle lanes that Mike King was talking about just before me. But we also recommend a fully separated shared use path for those who are not comfortable biking in those light vehicle lanes. Gives them an opportunity to get out of the road and to feel safe and comfortable. We also took a really deep dive into intersections. And I pulled this one out here because, you know, obviously this is close tying into the existing University of Louisville section. But what it might look like if we reimagined where the I-65 ramp comes into Eastern Parkway, removing some of those conflicts that we see at the intersection today where it dumps into that right turn lane and improving operations and safety for everyone. We also looked at things like two-way street conversions, so looking at Preston and Shelby Street, as well as a lot of innovative intersection designs. And all of these were really focused on slowing traffic, improving safety, and making it you know, easy for somebody to make that decision to not get in a car and drive, but to use another form of transportation. And then throughout the whole corridor, we did a really deep dive into active transportation holistically. So we were looking at transit stops and amenities, transit stop spacing, you know, sidewalk condition and connectivity and accessibility. Is a sidewalk there? Does it get you to the transit stop? Does it get you all the way to the corner? Is it blocked with utilities? As well as looking at our connections for lighting and safety and comfort for people to be able to walk, bike, and scooter throughout the corridor. So that was Eastern Parkway by the fire hose method. So I'm looking forward to maybe answering some more targeted questions as we continue. And I'll go ahead and hand it over to, I believe, Carrie.
Thank you. Really interesting. Interesting information, and I'm glad to hear that, you know, so much work has been done, especially on TARC routes. Is everybody seeing the slides at like a TARC bus? Okay, good. So I will go again kind of quickly through the slides. TARC's mission statement: deliver transportation services that enhance the greater Louisville community. We are in a very interesting time for TARC and for our, public transportation generally. COVID has been a tremendous impact. In some ways, I don't really like to say anything has been positive about COVID, but I think having a deeper understanding of the critical nature of what we did, we were, as an industry, we were deemed essential, kept operating throughout the pandemic, and also acknowledging the folks that continued to ride were folks who were needed in our community, whether that was nurses or grocery store clerks, like folks who also had to go to work or continue to travel. So it has been a definitely a challenging time, but I've really felt even more deeply committed to what I do and sort of being engaged in this space with public transportation. TARC services, we have 25 local and express routes. We have changed some of our commuter express routes over the past couple of years in recognition of how people aren't traveling in our community as they used to. Have some circulator routes. One of our circulator routes is folks at UofL's campus are probably very familiar with. Route 94. And then we provide Americans with Disabilities Act paratransit service. So that operates within 3/4 of a mile of our fixed routes and is a curb to curb, door to door service for people who, by nature of their disability, can't ride the fixed route. We also have a longstanding partnership with Kentuckiana Regional Planning and Development Agency for a van pool program that is called the Every Commute Counts. Let's see, next slide. The 94 Cardinal Shuttle, that's the route that goes from, or is a loop route from Papa John's Cardinal Stadium and then goes throughout, sort of on the outskirts of campus. And it's one of our really top performing routes. This is for a list of our TARC routes from the month of September and with the total monthly boardings for the month of September 2021, and then the average weekday boardings for each weekday for all of our routes. So you see the Broadway Route 23, very popular, the Cardinal Shuttle, the Preston route, so Preston Highway, 4th Street, Muhammad Ali, Dixie Rapid, and then our 18th Street bus, which is local service on Dixie Highway. Our ridership overall is just about 50% of what it was pre-COVID. So we have seen, at least in the past few months, a slight uptick from that, from kind of our lowest point where, a lot of people were working from home, a lot of virtual things happening, people not really traveling around. So we are anticipating that we will continue to see increased ridership as more people go back to work, as more businesses really fully open, as more people feel more comfortable to travel in the community. But there is a little bit of a caveat there because even anecdotally, you hear, well, my husband, he doesn't know that he will go back to work, or just people probably aren't going to commute in the way that they did, especially for those work trips that a lot of TARC service was built around into downtown and then out of downtown in the peak hour sort of commute pattern. So, we, as an industry, there's a lot of rethinking and wanting to explore different options, ways to deliver service differently. So it's certainly an exciting time to be in this space because there is a lot of, opportunity for change and some opportunity for innovation. I'll just make a note. We have close to 4,000 bus stops, about 300 shelters throughout our region, which includes Jefferson County, and some limited service in southern Indiana across the river, almost 500 benches. We have new digital displays that are part of our Dixie Rapid Bus. And then we have operated electric buses, zero emission electric buses in our fleet. Some of the circulator routes where they operated were put on temporary suspension with changes to COVID and impacts downtown. So, but I can talk a little bit more about electric buses and zero emissions kind of in the Q&A. We have a ton of things happening in our organization right now. I cannot mention enough, this is not exactly maybe the place for this, but we are hiring. We are feeling the labor shortage in our country as acutely as anybody else. And one of the one of the really big challenges is that we continue to get requests for service to get other workers to work. And we're having to tell folks we can't make that service happen because we don't have enough staff. We don't have the drivers to do the work that we say that, to meet the schedules that we say. So if you know anybody who is even marginally interested in public transportation as a career or as a bus driver, please have them take a look at TARC and our benefits and our hiring. I just can't emphasize that enough. A couple of the other exciting sort of planning and sustainability projects that we have happening is our TARC Tomorrow. That's an update of our long range plan. It's an update that from a plan that was started or completed in 2008, 2009. We are looking at a micromobility study. So this would be a study looking at different ways to deliver service, especially in more of the ex-urban locations. So think suburban locations, industrial business parks. Probably UofL is not at all an ex-urban location, but that micro-mobility study will certainly inform different ways for us to deliver service in our community. We are also working on a fleet transition plan for zero emission buses. So this is a study that will show us kind of stepwise approach on how we could incorporate additional zero emission buses into our fleet and over time, how we would incorporate those into our fleet. COVID still impacts our service. You are required to wear a mask pursuant to Transportation Security Administration mandate that's in place until January. But we're doing everything we can to make sure that our buses are safe, clean, and continuing to follow all the guidance on mask mandates and vaccine information as it comes. We have a couple projects, more sort of corridor level projects, looking at our Broadway bus route. That is one of, as I showed, that's one of our busiest and most well-used projects. There is some planning work being done by Metro Louisville on Broadway. Microtransit project, this will sort of be an offshoot of that micro mobility project, but kind of doing a pilot that would look at how to provide service in areas where maybe a 40-foot bus or kind of a traditional service delivery model doesn't work. Muhammad Ali and Chestnut, that's another one-way street conversion project. So kind of keep tracking that one. And then also some cross river and job connection services. But a lot of these depend on our ability to have people to do the work. So we are optimistic and excited about these projects, but understand that there is some real workforce challenges that we have right now. And hope to see you on board. If you are interested in writing, we have information on our website, and then I can put my email in the chat as well. I was going to, as I kind of stopped my screen share, I will say I'm really interested in the 2nd, 3rd Street conversion project for my father was an architect, and he designed the UofL Business School. And if anybody has any memory of even before that, the playhouse, that little white building that sort of sits in the median there, that playhouse was moved. I don't know where it was before, but he was the lead architect in moving that playhouse from its very original location. So that intersection is sort of near and dear to me for a couple different reasons. So anyway, thank you, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Glasser, and I'm an advocate with an organization called Streets for People. And, I had my ideas about what I was going to talk about, and then listening to everyone speak ahead of me, my mind is like swimming with all the interesting things that they've said and how I might just bring those up. in our role as advocates. So we're an advocacy organization that has worked with Metro Louisville a lot, with Gresham Smith. You know, I know Katie, I know Mike from different advocacy efforts that we've had, and so our role, I think of our role as sort of ideally, in the best case scenario, as being a little bit of a tailwind behind the efforts that Mike has described and Katie has described, and you know, supporting them. Sometimes I think we might be a little bit of an agitator around those things. So it's a balance between the tailwind and the agitation. Mike is always very nice, which I appreciate when I talk to him. He says he enjoys the conversations, and I appreciate that's the way we can take the tone. So I just wanted to sort of like bring up some of the things that formerly Bicycling for Louisville, currently Streets for People, the organization I'm part of, has been involved with, and a lot of these projects will be, again, are an interplay between advocates, Metro Louisville, and Gresham Smith, and so volume on the street, and we were able to, we advocated for adding a bike lane with a buffer separation. Looking down here, this is a project at UofL that took, again, what was a 2-lane road and turned it into a 1-lane road with a wider bike lane. And we've, as an advocacy organization, been involved in a number of projects around the UofL campus. I think, you know, a project that comes to mind is a road diet on the Hill Street, sort of going into Germantown. That was a while back, where that was a 4-lane road. We took it down to 3 lanes, added a buffered bike lane, things of that nature, and pushing for these reconfigurations to make the road safer for bikes, for scooters. This is a project that's at the Barrett Castlewood, and again, I'll point out, like, all these kind of conversations are between Metro. There's an advocacy effort to them in a lot of cases, and then Gresham Smith often is doing the work on the design work on the back end. So this is some design work that Katie might have done herself. I'm not sure. Yeah, she's nodding. So yeah, this is familiar to Katie. So this is a thing, you know, just to give folks maybe a sense of the timeline and how the pieces sometimes fit together, a nice world fit together. And like, I want to say in 2015, 2016, this is an advocacy effort that my organization brought forward to the city. We said, we think, you know, Barrett and Castlewood over by Tyler Park in Germantown has this ability for a protected bike lane on one side of the road. You know, Mike pushed back. He said he didn't want to do it. I said, come on, Mike, please, Mike. And, you know, back and forth, you know, not really, you know, there was you know, with these conversations, there's a lot of considerations. And I think, honestly, there was a lot of like immediate interest from Metro about, okay, how can we make this work? And like, what's reasonable? What's like, where's the political will? How far can we take this project? And so we took it essentially from Tyler Park on one end to Roofer is the name of the street on the other end, and we created this protected bike lane. And so, you know, there was definitely an advocacy piece to it. There was an engineering piece. Obviously, there was just a sort of a political piece, and so, you know, here's the project is outlined, you know, on the Metro website, where they describe what it is, and here are some renderings. Again, Katie probably was very involved in creating these. And you know, to me, like, this is a route I bike home every day on. I live in Douglas Loop. I work in Old Louisville, and you know, it's great. Like, there's such a sense of like pride that I feel from like biking home and seeing people like walking their dogs on this and pushing strollers on this. It's not just a bike lane. It's like, it truly is like a multimodal lane. And I think there was like initially like a discussion of it being a bike lane, and I've just been so happy to see that it's being used by everyone, just people walking to and from a park, on a very safe, wide sidewalk, multi-use path, whatever you want to call it. And I think one thing that our organization does is sort of, I like to think this is true, is sort of like raise the floor on the conversation. I remember when this project happened, like there was sort of just like mass confusion of like, what is this? There was like an article on Insider Louisville that like measured the sidewalk in terms of buckets of KFC chicken, like how many Abraham Lincolns could you fit across it? And it was, in my mind, sort of like, like this, let's raise the bar here a little bit, people. Like, this is not an insane idea. And the sort of expectation that this could be normalized is really important. And I do think actually we've seen that to some degree, in that we've been talking about road diet projects in this call. And I remember like early on being 2013, 2014, like every time there was a road diet, it was like kind of a drag out fight, kind of a thing. And I think, it's still a little bit, there is pushback. There's recently a road diet on Lexington Road, sort of over in St. Matthews. There's been a road diet on Southern Parkway recently. There's been a road diet, as Mike mentioned, Taylor Boulevard. And that's been great. Like, I think what we've seen is that these projects, like at a certain point in the past, were somewhat controversial. And I think they're less controversial now. And I think that to me is the advocacy work, and also just an aspect of getting these projects on the ground and seeing that, the world doesn't end when we do them, and that things actually work just fine. So I think that's that's an overview sort of Streets for People. It's funny that that's what I ended up talking about, because I planned to talk about two-way street conversions, and here I was talking about Barry Castlewood. But I think that's where I'll leave it off. And with that said, we can turn it back out to everyone else. Let's see, I need to stop my share.
Great. Thank you all so much for those presentations. It's always great to have panelists that have clearly worked together beforehand and have some synergy on projects that they've collaborated on. So that's wonderful. We've got some questions from the audience, and I just want to encourage folks to continue to submit those through the Q&A function. And so I just wanted to ask a question to the panelists, and then we'll move to some of those questions from the audience. So a lot of you kind of alluded to some of these things, but just sort of thinking, very big picture, and being visionary about our potential for our transportation system, and sort of reshaping it in a way that is oriented more towards pedestrians and cyclists and transit users. What do you think, in our current context, our current political, economic, social context, what are the greatest opportunities for actually making some of these changes? And if each of you could just give us your thoughts on what those opportunities might be here in Louisville right now. And if you wanted to talk a little bit about what some of the key barriers that you also see in your work for making those kinds of changes. And I'll just open the floor up to anybody who'd like to start with that.
I can go first, and one of the most exciting opportunities out there to make a lot of this a reality is an infrastructure package from a relatively progressive transportation secretary that will provide hopefully a lot of funding for a lot of the things that we've talked about today. Kentucky and Louisville in particular, I mean, Louisville's a red dot, or is a dot in a very rural state, basically. So our transportation policies here don't always align with sort of the transportation policies at our state capital level, which do have to serve all the needs of the state. But in terms of what we try to do in the most urban environment in this state, often conflicts with the policies at a state level, which oftentimes makes it really difficult for us to get funding for projects, because the way transportation funding is set up at a state level, it goes through what's called a shift process. And basically it's a scoring criteria that looks at all the transportation initiatives that are out there through all the various MPOs, as well as a few other projects. And the scoring system's set up to basically be scored off economic development, and economic development is usually measured through throughput on roadways and how many more cars you can get coming through places. So when we have these multimodal projects that we put in there, in hopes that we can get them funded, they just don't score well in the process. So it's a challenge. So this infrastructure package that who knows where it is right now, it changes every day, it seems like, but hopefully is coming, will be a huge boost for all our multimodal efforts. If I got my way, we'd give almost all of it to TARC and let them spend all the money and have a blast with it. But we could also integrate, I mean, as Carrie and any other transportation planner knows, TARC can only do so much. There's also that sort of last mile of service that really has to be taken into account. So it's got to be a really holistic effort. When we look at this, and we have really good partnerships, including our advocates, even if they're obnoxious sometimes, that we get to work with all the time. So that the partnerships there, I think a lot of the visions are there, but the funding for implementation is the challenge, I think. And if we got an injection of money, that could go a long way.
I'll pick up on kind of what Mike was saying, because I think the impact of the state roads and the state highway planning process is a challenge. And I will give a tremendous amount of credit to the really excellent work that the Transportation Cabinet does in a lot of ways. And I think I see them moving, in a much more forward and, I don't necessarily want to say progressive way, but I see change over time that I really want to applaud the efforts of the traffic engineers and the planners and everybody that works at the state. I've certainly beat up on them plenty over the course of my career, but I do feel like optimistic that there's a little bit of a tide that's turning. And the infrastructure bill, as Mike mentioned, is a big deal. It's a big deal both ways. If that bill does not go through, and there's the infrastructure bill, and then embedded in that is a long-term transportation, federal transportation authorization bill, previously called the FAST Act, MAP before that, ICE-T, T21, et cetera. If that bill doesn't go through, we can start to have the conversation locally or for TARC is very, very different, and quite frankly, pretty bleak. A lot of the questions that we get about service or why can't you do this do come down to money and funding. And we've been, funded with the same sort of structure. TARC has been funded with the same sort of structure since 1974. That is a difficult funding model to meet for a regional or commuter workshed that goes elsewhere and outward, now possibly to Hardin County, if you think about the Ford plant, the battery plant that Ford will have in Hardin County. So I'm always hesitant. I don't want to sound like a kind of a whiner or complainer, but some of this is just dollars input into a system. And if we don't have more money put in, then it is about changing our spend, whether that's, and as you brought up, the SHIFT program and ranking highway projects, which is almost always called a highway plan. It's difficult to get a transit project in a highway plan. And it's, if you put me in charge of the spending for the state of Kentucky, I personally would spend it a little differently, but I'm not in charge, and I probably would never be made Secretary of Transportation for that very reason. But it is a challenge. I think the infrastructure, the long-term transportation authorization bill will go through at some point. I think it's almost has to, because it impacts not just transit, but also all types of other transportation funding. But it is certainly a challenge. And sort of one last point on that I think is, from a sustainability standpoint, is important to mention. We're talking a lot about transportation. You got transportation folks on this panel, but we often talk about transportation and land use separately. I mean, they are planned differently, they are organized differently for a variety of reasons, but they are they are inextricably linked, and say that right, but they are linked whether you believe it or not, or whether you think that planning, for one is done the other. And it's like, that's really what I would love for us to be in a community, is really start to think about how can we better link land use and transportation planning so that they're working together instead of, quite frankly, at odds. A new subdivision or a new hospital that's located on the suburban fringe that doesn't have infrastructure, that doesn't have a transit line existing, isn't a great thing for TARC. It isn't a great thing for people who want to take TARC to get there. We have to figure out another way to pay for a new route without really any increase in funding. So I'm sorry, that was my soapbox on transportation and land use, but it just is so critical. And I'm just I really want to bring that to the forefront of discussions as much as I can.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Mike and Carrie. Those were really important comments. And so I want to give Katie and Chris a chance to jump in, but I also want to ask this question from the audience, which I think expands upon the current conversation that we're having about federal funding and sort of the potential around some of the infrastructure packages coming from the federal government. So this question's from Casa Heron, and she's saying that President Biden has said that he wants 40% of the reconciliation package invested in communities and people who have been directly affected by climate change. That means a lot of investment in poor and Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. So how would that change your work? If you could speak to that a little bit.
I can go again on that. It's challenging, truthfully, in a lot of ways, because one of the things we've learned the hard way, and probably deserve to learn the hard way, is when you're planning transportation systems or anything for that matter, and you're coming into different neighborhoods, it doesn't go well when you come in and say, hey, you're welcome, we're going to two-way your street, or we're going to do a road diet here, or we're going to shift this TARC line over here. So through a lot of our outreach, which is a really critical component of what we do, that's one of those things that we're learning quickly, that we really need to get out in front and talk to folks about what the issues are in their neighborhood. We hear it secondhand through politicians, or even people just kind of one-off calling in through our 311 system, or calling us directly, that, hey, like, speeding is an issue in my neighborhood. I'd love to slow cars down. So we inevitably, and my wife can attest to this, I like to try and solve problems instead of just like listening to people a lot of times. So it's like, all right, well, cool. People are speeding through your neighborhood. Here's the opportunities we can use to come in and slow people in your neighborhood. But when government that is justifiably doesn't have a lot of trust in a lot of the neighborhoods that we're talking about here, comes in and says, hey, this is what we're going to do for your neighborhood, it just fractures that trust relationship even more. So the critical component to that, I think, is making sure that the dialogue is open, continual, and that we're really listening. We're not just throwing it out there for token engagement, to see what the strategies for infrastructure packages and things like that could be most successful by being more of a community-driven effort.
Absolutely. And I can echo that as well. We've seen a lot of shift in our methodology over the years as far as public engagement, moving from, as Mike said, the person standing up at the podium and saying, we're going to do this, and shifting into a community-based engagement model where, we're meeting people where they are, hearing their voices and finding out what they would like to see in their own community, and then building upon those needs that have been, given to us, rather than coming in with a preconceived notion of what we're going to do in any specific location. And so it becomes more a presentation of toolbox options, rather than a one-size-fits-all, going through with a stamp and doing a road diet, for example, everywhere. Well, maybe that's not the right answer. So yeah, I think we've definitely seen a huge shift in our methodology and in our approach, even in the last few years. Is how do we engage different communities?
I might just add to that point, kind of to answer that question, but also to just sort of reemphasize the point I was making about transit service and where it goes in the community is making sure that we talk, and this is something that's important for TARC, that we talk about overall access in the community. We've talked a lot and for many, many years about ridership. We want to get ridership up. I led my slide deck with talking about ridership for certain routes, but you know, access in the community, and not just geographic access. Oh, there is a line on a map. There is a TARC route that goes down the street, but also the like what we would call like temporal access. Like how long does it take to get there? How long does it take for, you know, what's the time difference to take TARC, to take a private car, to take a bike? And I think that's where, you know, when I talk to my counterparts across the country, that's really the conversation that we want to start to have is what is the real choice? What is the real access that transit can provide for people and communities? Because just investing in necessarily the neighborhoods where people that are underserved or, you know, are impacted by climate change only helps. I mean, you want to make sure that people can get everywhere in the community, not just in the one neighborhood that they live in or in one place, and that it's equitable and accessible for lots of people.
Great, thank you. Thanks for all of those thoughtful responses. So we do have a couple of other questions from the audience. So this is from Justin Mogg. This is a pretty specific TARC question. So Justin is asking, why did TARC's free Lift circulator go away, and will it come back? And if not, can we please get the Lift signage removed from the sidewalks, especially at 3rd and Brandeis, where it's blocking a narrow and very important sidewalk at a bottleneck in front of a business that's there, the Ville Grill. So Carrie, I think that one might be for you.
Yes, thank you. I know there's a couple of folks from TARC in the audience. So if somebody can take a note about that Lift sign at 3rd and Brandeis, I'd appreciate that, and we'll kind of follow up with that. My understanding, the Lift circulator went away when at the onset of COVID or close to it. It has not been in operation since I've been here, to my knowledge. So I think it was a kind of a COVID route casualty, as we called it. It is something that we have been talking about bringing back, and have gotten a couple of requests here and there to bring back. As I mentioned before, please, if you know folks who want to become bus drivers, please send them our way, because we really can't add or make any, like, we can't bring that route back because we don't have enough drivers to do the work right now. So we would love to bring it back, given, you know, funding and available resources, but we'll take a look at that stanchion that's there. Certainly did not intend for it to block an important sidewalk, but we can take a look at that.
Great, thank you. And so another question from DJ Biddle. He's interested in any thoughts about the ways to make the Louisville bikes on campus more useful for students, faculty, and staff. Is there a way to subsidize or offer free memberships? Is there campaigns that can be done in terms of awareness and building awareness? Just that it seems like an underutilized resource that is sitting idle most of the time.
My argument would just be they need to be like more ubiquitous. Like, it's like there's just not enough of a sort of a critical mass of stations and bikes. They're just not easily accessible. I feel like you have to sort of know where the stations are to drop them off. And I think they're just, you know, when people, I'm not one to think that like education is the way to get people to ride more scooters or more bikes. It's like the ubiquity of it, the ease of it, the convenience of it is always what comes down to it. And like, scooters are just so easy. I don't know why you wouldn't ride a scooter. It's super easy, you know, like that's why people do. And so, you know, as I was coming through campus just the other day, I was thinking, I was sort of had a similar thought where I was like, there's that bike station between Second and Third on that little island, and it's always full of bikes, and I never see anyone riding a Louisville. And I'm like, I get it. I understand why people don't ride Louisvilles. So I don't know if that's an answer. That's maybe just a corroboration, but I don't see it happening.
I'll also add, I believe, and I could be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure there's a discount associated with UofL students. But if people aren't aware of that, that's something we definitely need to market a little bit better. The other one that I think is kind of twofold is, like Chris said, you got to rethink the system a little bit. And I think there's multiple components to that. One of them is the infrastructure that gets people with where they want to go. It's great. It's great to hop on a bike and offer a bike share, but being right there at Second and Third Street, I don't know how many people would feel comfortable hopping on a bike, especially a Louisville bike, which can be a little bit bigger and a little bit bulkier. So we've got to really be cognizant of where people are starting and where they're going and plan the stations accordingly on that. The other side of it is bike technology is coming along. E-bikes are pretty awesome. So if we could start to maybe look to integrate some of those e-bikes and things in there to start to compete with those scooters where it's a, hey, this is a really fun way to ride around. Those are those opportunities, I think, that really draw people in. Through a lot of the research we're seeing nationally, the bike share stations that are doing the best, the reason they're doing the best right now is because they put in e-bikes and even included scooters in some of their programs. But staying up at the times, ultimately, I think, is an opportunity where we could improve upon that.
Can I go back to a previous question to talk about the money aspect of it? And of course, like, money is incredibly important. Like, a couple years back, I wrote this like whole series for Insider Louisville about Shift and how, essentially just made funding projects for the city very difficult. So I totally agree with the funding aspect of that. I just want to say, like, political will is an underrated problem and difficulty. And I would point to, for instance, the Cherokee Park, recent decision of Cherokee Park of opening it back up to cars and for accessibility reasons, things like that. And that was not a decision based on any amount of money, really. It was based on like the political optics of that, is my sense of it. And sometimes you can do, I think what we found with a lot of the projects that we've been able to do with Mike, with the bike network, with the scooter network, with the multimodal network, is that some of them can be done very cheaply. And the budget for that has been like pretty minimal. It's been in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for the city budget that's in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And so we've been able to build a bike network. And I think there was a little more political will around that earlier, maybe a decade ago or 8 years ago. And I think they've just sort of like become a little bit of a hot button issue that where people push back on that to some degree. And so I think like the Cherokee Park example is one where, I think that was like a low cost change to the way that park was used. Again, the idea was that you could drive to the park, but you couldn't drive through the park on the scenic loop. And they had designated access points throughout the park for cars. But something about that, became like a politically hot issue, and it moved to where they, now allow cars back on into the park.
Chris, I think that's a great point about political will and cost, not always being sometimes, but not always being the key point, and that there are a lot of things that we can do that don't cost as much. I mean, there's a lot of ways to make bus service, TARC service, more effective or more efficient on roadways that doesn't cost a ton of money. I mean, I say this all the time, like, I'm a transit planner, 25 years into my career. I'd love to do major big projects, rail, high-speed rail. Like, I'm super excited about that, big ticket and really, transformative projects. But there's a lot that we can do queue jump lanes, like some of the things that we've put into place on Dixie Rapid, and that, you know, with partnership with Louisville Metro, with the premium transportation corridors that are part of our long range plan that you can do that don't cost a ton of money. They may not be quite as transformative, but they can still make a difference and can really improve that to give people a real choice in what they do. I mean, we talk a lot about, oh, well, I mean, the transportation planning thing is mode choice, but do you really have a choice to do things differently right now? I mean, kind of, sort of, you know, if you want to try and find a Louisville bike or try and make sure that you have a safe way to go down. So I think I'm not quite sure that we exactly have provided as many choices as we want to. I mean, we're getting there. I think we're making really good progress, but there certainly are some things we can do in the meantime that aren't huge ticket items, unless that Biden infrastructure bill goes through and we get to do high-speed rail and all the cool stuff that I've been dreaming about for years.
And I feel like the funding and the political will and, talking to the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet, like I feel like it's all coming together into this conversation because, KYTC, I think, is in the middle of this shift from we've had traditional roadway data, and that's how we make decisions is, how many cars can I get through? What's the optimal signal timing to get people in a car from point A to point B, and making that shift away from solely relying on those old methods of data and trying to understand like what makes something safe and comfortable and usable and dignified for somebody who has to or is choosing to use an alternate mode of transportation. But also, I've noticed, and it's slow, but I've noticed a shift in this idea that maybe we should try pilot projects. And I know, pilot projects are only as good as, that they get you to the next step. But I'm seeing a lot of interest in, deploying some of those tactical opportunities to say, yes, it can work here. Let me prove it to you. And then once I prove it to you, let's take that to the next step. And then what are 6 other places that we can do kind of some of these low cost opportunities and keep the needle moving forward rather than at status quo or worse, going backwards.
I have a question for Katie.
Sure.
Like
Okay.
as someone who works in a lot of different communities, we sort of are focused on the Louisville bubble, and I'm wondering how you've seen this like chemistry amalgamation of forces come together in other areas. Has there been like interesting other spaces where you're sort of surprised how a project can come to life, or like what's politically possible, where the funding is coming from that's different than what you see in Louisville?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work really closely with some of my colleagues in our Florida offices. And so Florida has a rather robust multimodal investment program. And it's been really interesting to see there. I don't have the information at hand to just pull up quickly, but working on a trail system in Lake Jackson, Florida, where we were actually able to get buy-in from Florida DOT as well as FHWA to work in what would be considered a interstate easement, as long as we had appropriate barriers and we're keeping people safe. Things that sometimes here we hit a little bit of a barrier. One, I think some of that is because they have the funding available in many instances to go after some of those larger projects. But also I think that there's been a little bit maybe better communication between those two entities historically, as well as with consultants and with the cities down there in order to move those projects forward. So it's been really cool to see the needle move forward. We've also been working on a platform internally at Gresham Smith, patent pending. It's the Empathic data analytics program. And so what we're actually looking at is the autonomic responses of somebody who is walking, biking, scootering, driving through a corridor. And so those are the response that you get from someone that they're not thinking about it, right? We're looking at stress and comfort, and we're finding that those stressors can actually indicate in areas for vulnerable roadway users, that we need to take action at those locations because there may not actually be a crash history there. And we're seeing, we've had, good conversations again with the state of Florida, but we're actually, presenting that to KYTC, and they're very interested in piloting those kinds of projects here in Kentucky to see how they can use that platform to be more proactive rather than reactive. So I'm very hopeful for the future moving forward and moving towards these more sustainable methods of transportation and making them more of a focus than just getting cars places.
Wonderful. Well, that is a fairly hopeful note for us to close on, and we are unfortunately out of time, but this has been such a robust and detailed discussion. I want to sincerely thank all of our panelists, Katie, Chris, Carrie, and Mike. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, for being part of Sustainability Week here at UofL. So I just want to invite everyone, as we're sort of closing out, if there are specific events or advocacy opportunities or other upcoming planning processes that you want to make sure that this audience knows about, please link to those in the chat. So we heard a lot about the KYTC, Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. They're in the midst of updating the long-range statewide transportation plan. So I'm going to put a link in the chat to just encourage folks to participate in that and share your feedback. Just remind everybody again that there are a couple of other opportunities to participate in Sustainability Week. And I'll also put a link to that in the chat. Encourage students or anyone else that was here for today's roundtable, if you are interested in digging deeper in these topics. We offer a number of degree programs at UofL where you can do just that. And many of them are housed in my department, the Department of Urban and Public Affairs. So if you're interested in planning and sustainability and urban studies, I'm happy to talk with you more about that. And I think that is all the closing remarks that I had. So thank you again to all of our panelists, and thank you everyone else for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.